Greetings, friends of liberty. I did want to mention that sometimes, even amongst the French, one can find now and again a believer in freedom in the English sense, and I note particularly in this regard the example of the much-admired French economist and one-time cabinet minister and Robert Jacques Turgot. If only there had been more like him in Cheeseland. Turgot is finance minister of Louis XVI from 1774 to 76. A. promulgated an edict for the free trade in grain against the opposition of speculating nobles. B. radically reduced the size of the king's budget, cutting the deficit by cutting expenditures to the bone. C. abolished in part the corvée, or forced labor. D. removed privileges of the guilds. And E. even attempted to get the nobility and clergy to pay some taxes. Truly radical. In fact, if more had listened to him, the present cataclysm in France that has taken so many innocent lives might well have been avoided. Nonetheless, despite his great understanding of the value of freedom and fiscal prudence, Turgot believed that the state should finance the education of children. In other words, that educational freedom could not work. And yet more surprising, if we turn to 19th century England, we find even here in this land of freedom an enormous number of educated persons utterly misunderstanding the superiority of private education. This irrational belief in public education in many ways is mirroring the present English delusion in the superiority and necessity of socialized medicine in the form of the NHS. In today's book by educational researcher Phil Gardner, entitled The Lost Elementary Schools of Victorian England, our historian chronicles the tragedy of the destruction of many thousands of excellent working-class private schools replaced by the inferior public and council schools who since have damaged Britain and its children enormously, dumbing the entire nation down for close to a century and a half. I note in passing that there are many instances in the historiography of education of liberal and progressive educational reformers and scholars either utterly failing to perceive the existence or the value of excellent working-class schools. Time and again, they've shown that they don't believe the poor can educate themselves. Here are three notable instances. A. In James Tooley's The Beautiful Tree, which I reviewed here, the whole book described his discovery of thousands of superior working-class schools in India, Africa, and China, superior to public schools, often giving better results for one-third or less the cost of public. Had all the educational do-gooders in the UN, Save the Children, or Oxfam International recognized them or their value? No, overwhelmingly not. But here, staring them in the face, was the answer to how to educate millions of third-world children well at little expense. B. In Sam Blumenthal's book, Is Public Education Necessary? He mentions that in Boston, Massachusetts in 1817, the report of the Bullfinch Committee found that in that city of 40,000 people, 96% of children were in school and 61% of those school children were in private schools. So no problem with parents supplying their own education. Nonetheless, various Harvard intellectuals, influenced by the recently imported German and European ideas of educational coercion, exemplified by the newly formed Prussian educational system, also slighted the instruction found in Boston private schools. One, for example, said, "They learn nothing, or what amounts very much to the same thing, nothing that they care to know." C. In Charles Carroll's Public Education in Rhode Island, he notes that the historians of the past who found general school laws in Massachusetts and Connecticut in the middle of the 17th century and none in Rhode Island before 1828 reached the conclusion that Rhode Islanders were backward in providing schools, ignoring the fact that there were 193 schoolhouses in Rhode Island in 1828. So again, all these private or quasi-private schools were ignored by these historians who just assumed that without laws mandating the creation of schools, apathetic parents wouldn't provide their own. Now, as Gardner demonstrates, this 19th century bias has been passed on to modern historians. As he says, our understanding has been inherited directly from the blanket condemnation of 19th century educationists who had a particular interest in promoting the demise of working-class private schooling. And what was that 19th century bias like in England? Here are some examples from that century which mirror those I gave above. I do not reckon the dame schools, as they are merely loose boxes for turning the young children into to be out of harm's way. Nurseries of inaccuracy and superficiality. Worthless. I do not know whether I was most astonished at the badness of the premises or the poverty of the instruction. Misnamed a school. Monstrous that the efforts of your lordships to educate the masses of the people should be frustrated by reason of the persistent opposition of these miserable adventure schools. A private school is for some occult reason held to be more respectable. These dens of ignorance and malaria to which 1/3 of the laboring classes still send their children, although good and cheap public schools are at their doors. As Gardner says, many of these 19th century educational reformers thought that working-class private schools were not schools at all, but mere baby-minding establishments kept by illiterate old women. And the historiographical result of this extensive bias? There is very little worthwhile secondary material on the subject of working-class private schooling. So that's what his book, in part, aims to correct. Partly this prejudice was expressed in the statistical mistakes these historians or collectors of 19th century statistics made when trying to assemble data or analyze reports. For example, A, they often didn't realize that while pupils weren't always in school, they got some schooling depending on whether their parents could afford it or whether agricultural or seasonal conditions might require their field work. As Gardner says, such a pattern of intermittent scholarship is a recurring one throughout working-class autobiographies. And the result was that discrepancies in the number of scholars declared by schoolkeepers and those given by inspectors who visited the schools a few months later are often substantial. B. Secondly, some schools weren't even recorded as schools because middle-class investigators, in their contempt, couldn't imagine them as worthy of the name. So, for example, the small private schools are very bad and not worthy of investigation. C. Another type of mistake resulted from the fact that some proprietresses, being wary of the attentions of the state and the lengthy form to be completed, at first wouldn't even admit towards having a school, and only did when pressed. As Gardner says of Mary Horn, a 40-year-old widow, in this instance the enumerator has initially recorded her occupation simply as dressmaker, but has subsequently added the words "and mistress school." It is likely that a less conscientious enumerator would not have bothered to later amend his entry, leaving Miss Horn to go down in history as nothing more than a dressmaker and consigning her school to historical oblivion. And this would explain why some people were listed on the population census as having schools but not on the education census. As Gardner says, the overwhelming preponderance of wives with employed husbands among the non-declarers points to a specific working-class grouping of schoolkeepers whose activities would have been wholly unknown to investigators. Now let's ask, what then were these working-class private schools like? In general, they were enormously free to respond to parental demand and thus possessed much more diversity as businesses to a range of parental needs than the modern factory schools of K-12 education find either then or today. So, for example, in no particular order of importance, they overwhelmingly taught reading, since this is what parents wanted the most, and for girls often sewing and for boys accounts. Sometimes schools were named for the instruction of a particular skill, thus lace schools, straw plait schools, and seaming schools. B. Writing came next, although it wasn't as high in demand as reading. C. Parents paid by the skill taught, so when they got more money, they could then pay for more learning. D. Common day schools were the next step up from dame schools and generally had slightly older kids, although there was much overlap in ages from under 5 to 15 in both. E. Teachers were well known in the community, and thus their specific skills and general character were usually a proven commodity. In addition, schoolmasters or mistresses often were called upon for other community tasks, such as writing a letter or reading something an illiterate person couldn't. F. One of the things that made the cost of schooling so very affordable was that schoolmistresses sometimes interspersed their instruction with other activities like spinning or doing laundry. As Gardner says, giving one example, the mistress was walking backward and forward, spinning some clothier's wool into yarn and performing her scholastic duties at the same time. A boy was in the act of reading his lesson aloud to her. This combination of activities resulted in a highly efficient use of the personnel resources of a community as well as very low cost. G. Working class schools weren't patronized to get a posh accent or genteel status, but instead for the very practical skills that could help the youngsters succeed in the real, often brutal world outdoors. H. What parents also liked was that dame schools and common schools didn't preach morality and didn't try to indoctrinate children in an upper-class ethos. Instead, just helping them acquire the skills they paid for. This was different from public schools. Public school inspectors disapproved, one saying that parents appear to be wholly indifferent to the subject of morality. As Gardner says, in private schools, very few mistresses appeared to think it was part of their duty to instruct the children in morals. One in particular insisted with much warmth that to teach morals was the duty of the parents, not hers. I. Schools were often located on the same street as parents, which heightened student safety and reduced travel time. J. In some instances, pupils weren't even educated in these private schools, but by their parents at home, up to 17% in some cases. In fact, some dame schools started when these ladies educated their own children first, found that they had a gift for teaching, and then progressed to neighborhood children. K. In some cases, schoolmistresses even traveled to the home of the parents to give students lessons there. Imagine expecting that from today's modern teacher who is a member of teachers' unions with all the rights and governmental privileges he expects. L. In private schools, there were likely a higher percentage of female teachers, as females seem overall very capable of handling young children well. As Gardner says, whether or not it was true, it was widely held that women were kinder, more tolerant, and more sympathetic to children than were men. M. Many private teachers understood that the income of these poor families was variable and uncertain, and so by necessity, they would teach children at times for free in the hope of getting at least some remuneration later on. N. Occasionally, working-class schools could change their place of residence, given the necessity or desire of teachers to change. As Gardner says, where schools can be tracked in a single urban location, it is clear that removal within the same city within a 10-year period was extremely common. In Bristol, of 69 known examples of working-class private schools surviving over such a period, only 26% were kept at the same address throughout. O. Sometimes working-class schools were in ill-designed buildings, often dirty, dark, damp, and unsanitary. But overall, this didn't affect the educational results much and lowered the cost. P. Partly parents and children liked working-class schools because they gave an atmosphere of freedom and respect for the children's independence. In public schools, however, as one former pupil said, all the children as a class came out together to a series of commands. 1, and you stood in your desk. 2, and you put your left leg over the seat. 3, and the right joined it. 4, you faced the lane between the classes. 5, you marched in the spot. 6, you stepped forward and the pupil teacher chanted left, right, left, right, left, right. Q. Because of this freedom and independence, instruction was much more individualized. As Gardner says, each child in attendance was given a particular task to prepare, whether learning the alphabet, reading a passage, or writing a copy. From time to time, each pupil would come up to the teacher's chair and they would work through the task together. Public school officials, however, saw this as formless and disorganized. R. What sometimes happened was that once public schools became more common, if parents were in bad financial difficulties, they would send their children to the free public school, but then, when they had money again, back to the more effective dame or working class school. And that's because public schools were regarded by many as inferior. One private schoolmistress said that she has known some children to be 9 months in such a school and never to have learned a single task. S. So having seen all the advantages of working class private schools, what happened to them after 1870 when public schools were introduced and subsidized on a massive scale? They were gradually driven out of business. How? In the following ways. A. First, some parents and schoolmistresses came to the mistaken conclusion that private schooling was now illegal and gave it up voluntarily, but this was actually not the law per se. B. Private schools were required to fill out a detailed form so their alleged efficiency could be judged. But some schoolmistresses were not given the form because not many people actually knew of the existence of their schools, and other schoolmistresses refused to fill it out of fear. A third group did fill out the forms, but of these, only about 8% passed inspection, due naturally to the alleged failings of various sorts, such as of accommodation, space per pupil, teacher quality, or cleanliness. All this meant that the vast majority of schools were, for the varied reasons just given, judged inefficient, and so if parents sent their children to these, they could be charged with educational neglect. As Gardner says, the inspection discounted at a stroke most of the school places occupied by over 44,000 of London's children. C. Working class parents were systematically brought to magistrates when their children nonetheless continued at these allegedly inefficient schools. But the problem was, very often, the magistrates sided with the parents, after in some cases having tested the children as to their knowledge and queried the specific schoolmistresses themselves. D. The state then responded by passing new legislation requiring pupils to get attendance and proficiency certificates. The attendance certificate, after revisions of the law, became impossible to acquire unless the students attended a certified school, and by definition, for-profit schools couldn't be certified. So the law simply pretended that for-profit schools weren't good enough to be certified. Secondly, the proficiency certificate could only be gotten by A, taking an exam, B, at the nearest public school, C, with the permission of authorities at that school. So in practice, getting the proficiency certificate also was made very difficult for most children. The decisive point was that without these two certificates, a child couldn't get a labor certificate, meaning that he couldn't work while he was attending private school. And since most poor parents couldn't afford to give up that income, being as cash-strapped as they were, this meant that between the ages of 10 and 13, such children were legally unemployable. Such a sacrifice could hardly be made by poor families who depended on the maximization of familial income at the earliest practicable point. And this meant that by the 1880s, the state had succeeded in closing the doors of these schools for lack of students. So in conclusion, I would give this book an A-, it offering an excellent deep dive for those both interested in understanding the intrinsic superiority of private working class education and the unjustified bias that many otherwise educated persons of all stripes, whether historians, bureaucrats, or liberal members of the public, bring to the subject. One final point. In elementary education, the most basic economic forces at work are readily seen right before you, because compared to higher education, the whole field is much simpler. With A, small schools instead of universities with thousands or tens of thousands of students. B, no big sports teams. C, no hundreds of courses. D, no huge budgets. And E, fewer governmental laws and regulations. And one of the basic economic forces to be seen at work here that is clearly evident and that is highly relevant to an understanding of the development of woke ideology in the West, both in the universities and K-12, is the fact that, as can be readily seen in these reports, as I described, working class parents will only pay for what's essential and highly resist attempts to indoctrinate their children religiously or ethically. And so, we can again see, by this basic principle in operation here from these reports, so clearly in elementary schools, that woke ideology nowadays too at every level would hardly ever be regarded by parents as essential if they had to pay for it themselves directly as tuition. Which means the only way that woke ideology can develop and has developed is by being financed by the state through taxation. The same parental forces of resistance illustrated here in 19th century grammar schools would have been at work and ensured that woke ideology never came into being if the West hadn't so much governmental influence and monies flooding into both higher education and K-12 since World War II. With the hope that those in the West who love educational excellence will start to see more and more how jettisoning public education at all levels would confer enormous societal benefits of both increased quality and lower costs to us all, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.